Ladies and gentlemen in the coffee break area, please return to the ballroom. We are about to begin the next session. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage Dr. Karen Domfried.
Okay, is everyone pumped with caffeine? Yeah? That's great, because before we go into our next discussion of inclusive innovation, I have a very exciting announcement to make. And that is that about 6 months ago, GMF was selected by the U.S. State Department's Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs to administer their Young Transatlantic Innovation Leaders Initiative, which is better known as YTILI. And YTILI empowers young European entrepreneurs with the tools, networks, and resources they need to grow their enterprises. YTILI is also a vehicle for building a network of innovators who can contribute to both local and transatlantic policy dialogues about entrepreneurship and innovation as a strategy for economic mobility and security. Today, we are delighted to announce that we have selected 100 fellows representing 44 European and Eurasian countries to participate in YTILI. And it is a truly impressive group. About half of those fellows are women entrepreneurs, and they are all launching really cool ventures. One of the youngest fellows from Greece has created a global online platform to match individuals with volunteer opportunities. Another is using open source satellite data from NASA and the European Space Agency to enable people from around the world to monitor the status of glaciers. So I would love to tell you more of these stories, but you can see what an interesting mix of projects these are. And so if I've sparked your interest, you can use BF Connect to learn more. You'll find all the names of the fellows and their businesses listed in the app, and you can also go to the YTILI website and get all of that information. Now, you can tell this is a big deal for GMF, and I'm really delighted also that here with me is my former colleague and friend, Conrad Tribble, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department in the European and Eurasian Bureau. So Conrad, over to you.
Thanks, Karen. And it is not true that we did this just so I could get a speaking slot at the Brussels Forum. This is a real quick just cheerleading plug from the State Department, but it is, in fact, a really important program for us and something that we started only relatively recently. But we have been big on entrepreneurship. You will find at embassies around Europe that they all have different programs to promote entrepreneurship, both as a way of reaching out to local communities, including underserved and sort of non-traditional communities, but also as a way of linking interesting Americans into their country, whether it's Portugal or Lisbon or Ukraine or anywhere else. And entrepreneurship is jobs, it's creativity, it's good social ideas in different communities. It's a lot of good things about sort of the American way of life or the American experience matched up and married up with very interesting and innovative Europeans as well. And so it's just something that we do as part of our diplomatic effort. I have no reason to believe that we won't continue doing that in this administration. We are certainly pursuing this as we go. I had a chance to meet with the fellows last year who came on last year's program in Washington, D.C. They put you to shame. You listen to them. You realize you have done nothing with your life when you see some of the programs and projects that these people are putting together at very young ages. That's the same with this year's group. About 700 applicants that came out that turned out into the 100 selectees. They will come to the United States in the course of the next year for about a three-week program around 10 different states. They'll be matched up with specific companies. They'll be doing host family stays, a lot of different things in their short time in the United States. And then there'll be about 20 Americans in this year's program who will go to Europe and do the same thing. And it's all about trying to just bring people together in an interesting and creative niche or an interesting creative sector, namely that of entrepreneurs. If you think about how many young companies that started by Europeans have benefited from the transatlantic experience. Skype, Spotify, Stripe, others have all had that transatlantic sense to them, and that's what we hope will come out of this. So thanks very much to GMF for being our partner. I hope this program will continue into the future. Lots of questions. I know that I can't answer them, but we're going to have a great program this year, and we really appreciate working with GMF. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much for helping explain why this is also so important for deepening transatlantic partnership. And we're really delighted to be working with the State Department on this. And I have to say, Conrad joked that this wasn't just for him to get a speaking slot at Brussels Forum. I'm standing up here, but all of the hard work on the GMF side has been done by my amazing colleagues in the Urban and Regional Policy program. And so a huge shout out to all my colleagues who have done the work so far and will implement this program, I know, very successfully at GMF. I want to welcome all of you folks in the audience, our Brussels Forum partners, to consider getting engaged in supporting these young entrepreneurs and inviting them into our shared transatlantic network. Basically, what's going to happen next is these YTILI fellows are going to fan out across 10 U.S. cities this summer to experience what entrepreneurship and innovation looks like on the ground. The fellowship year will culminate with a transatlantic forum next April in Berlin. So there are really lots of opportunities for all of you to get involved as well. These YTILI fellows are representatives of small and medium-sized businesses that make up the backbone of the European and American economies. They also reflect the growing importance of the digital economy in providing opportunities for new business development, but also in providing the goods and services that pave the way towards more inclusive growth. So we're now going to turn our attention to this very important topic around innovation in the next session. So please join me in welcoming our moderator for that session, Silke Tempel, who is editor-in-chief of the Berlin Policy Journal. Silke, over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, hello and welcome. Please take your seats. This is a wonderful panel on something that I believe, after listening to most of the panelists here, is a core issue. Inclusive innovation. When you remember Walter Russell Mead's introductory remarks, he spoke about an age of abundance. And of course, if you talk about abundance, you would wonder why, if we have an age of abundance, is there so much angry complaints? Of course, it has to do with the fact that abundance is not there for everyone. And remember the numbers that 1% of the upper 1% of people gains 38 times more than 90% of the rest. We've been talking in some of the other panels about representative democracy and how inequality, economic inequality, or inequality of options and chances and opportunities within society, of course, undermines representative democracy. We've had a wonderful session so far, thanks to GMF, which has been pretty much a techie conference in a way, which I think is absolutely great because it goes to the core of many of the problems that we are dealing with right now. One of it, yesterday evening, I don't know who joined the Oxford debate on the democratization potential of the internet, which started out pretty positively and optimistic. And then I guess it was very much also due to the convincing powers of Ivan Krastev, ended on a much more mellow note. That perhaps, the enthusiasm about the internet and its democratizing forces is a bit overblown. If you're looking, and we do this very often, and I'm actually a historian by training, if you look at historical analogies, we very often, especially in times of populism, go back to the 20s or the 30s of the 20th century. It seems to me that we got the wrong analogy. I think we should go back more to the 19th century, the late 19th century, which was an age of technological innovation. A communication revolution with the rise of telegraph, which has changed the way we were communicating within societies and even the way governments were governing. Much like it, I think, like now. So I think there are more elements in studying the 19th century than it is now, including, that this age started with quite a bit of enthusiasm about technological innovation, and then saw the rise of the Luddites, who thought that this technology is kind of disrupting everything they knew and everything they were familiar with, and then ended it in something that which is probably much more realistic than what we see now. Technology is both. And my feeling is that we're living in a time where we face what we could call a technological schizophrenia, in the sense that on one hand, we embrace modern technology very enthusiastically. There's no one in this room who would not have a smartphone, and probably a tablet, and probably a laptop as well, and probably has all three devices with him or her right now. So we embrace it happily. On the other way, we are facing fears about the disruptive forces of technology. What will it do to our job landscape? Will it take away jobs? What about robotics? What about the enormously quick innovation in the field of artificial intelligence? Autonomous driving, all these things. So this is exactly what we are talking about. And since this is the Brussels Forum, of course, we're not talking about the diagnosis once again. I think we're all familiar with it. We're talking about therapy. How can we tackle this technological schizophrenia? Is it only, quote unquote, about economic measures that we can have to make innovation more inclusive? Or does it also have to do with mindsets? And this is exactly what I will ask this wonderful panel. Before I introduce this panel to you, though, we'll have a poll up, and I would like you to put up the question, because I would like to measure your pulse on your technological schizophrenia right now, and then I would like to ask the panelists to convince you that technology has more opportunities than challenges. So, do you think that the digital economy can be a path towards inclusive growth, or is it a disrupting force? One is path to inclusive growth, B is disruptive force. You see, it's a very yes and no question. Vote, and I'll show you the results a bit later. And in the meantime, I introduced a wonderful panel to you. Caroline Atkinson, right here, is the head of Global Public Policy Google. And of course, she's also very experienced when it comes to governance, because you were an advisor on global economics in the Obama administration. Thanks very much for coming. Robert Atkinson is the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And when I had a glimpse at your CV, I thought you're kind of a guru of technological innovation. Thanks for coming. We're very curious to hear what you have to say. Ambroise Foyol is the vice president of the European Investment Bank and very much dealing with, of course, innovation. So we, of course, would like to hear, where do we invest and what exactly do we do? And then we have James Manyika, the director of the McKinsey Global Institute. And I was very impressed that you have an MA in AI and robotics, right?
Yes, I do.
Wonderful. Thanks for coming. James, I would like to start with you, because when we were talking about it before, you said, inclusive technology? Yes, yes, maybe. Very short answer, but I would like you to elaborate a bit.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. As you pointed out, I did my PhD in AI and robotics years ago, and I live in Silicon Valley. But I think to this question of is a digital economy good for inclusive growth? My response, as I said, is yes, yes, maybe. And let me talk about each of those yes, yes, and maybe portions. The first yes speaks to the role that technological progress and innovation plays in driving productivity, which leads to economic growth, which leads to prosperity. I mean, this has been the story of economic growth for the last 200 years, you could argue. And in fact, especially in the last 50 years, most of our economies have benefited from the technological progress that's led to productivity growth and prosperity. So that's a good thing. And in fact, you see this beyond the macro level. If you go to the economy level, you see this in businesses. Businesses that are more digital, businesses that are more technologically advanced, have higher growth rates in terms of their revenue growth rates. They have higher profit growth. In fact, wage growth for those businesses is far higher. And they tend to be the companies that are disrupting and changing everything. You also see it at the level of small businesses. Small businesses, entrepreneurs today, do much better when they're more digitally enabled. We know that, for example, small SMBs that are on global platforms export at 80x the rate of businesses that are not on global platforms, where they can reach suppliers, customers, and so forth. So it's good for business, both large and small. It's also good for startup entrepreneurs who are able to do things that they couldn't do before. So that's all part of the big yes. The second part of the yes goes to what technology does for us as users and consumers. And I think you made the point about the devices and so forth. But I think there are two parts of that that are important to elaborate on. One is the massive amounts of utility we get from that as users and consumers of these technologies. Also related to that is the fact that many of these products and services are mostly free or very, very cheap. And even that's changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Think about all the free services, applications we have, search technology, communication technology. So as users, I think it's almost unequivocally a good thing for us as consumers.
Apart from the media, which has been suffering greatly from free content that it has put out.
Oh, but I think the users love it. I still say the users love it.
The providers love it less.
I think the users love it. They get free information. They can search all kinds of news. I think it's a good thing for users. I think the businesses have to figure out how they adjust to that. I think it's also good for users from the point of view of we're now at the cusp of technological breakthroughs that are going to benefit us as members of society. Think about what AI and machine learning and artificial intelligence is going to start to do to things like synthetic biology, to climate change, and help us address those things in quite novel and interesting ways. So that's the yes, it's good for business, for the economy. Yes, it's good for users and consumers. Let's get to the maybe. The maybe has to do with what it means for workers, work, and wages. And that is a real maybe, because I think there what happens depends a lot on the choices that we make. And here I just want to highlight two particular areas of this workers and wages question. The first one has to do with automation. I think there's no denying it that automation is upon us. In fact, it's been going on for a very long time. But I think at this point, we're making the kind of breakthroughs that are going to cause us to ask new questions about automation. I'll give you just three numbers: 50, 5, and 60. The 50 refers to the percentage of the share of worker activities that can be automated. We've done some studies, and others have done too, that try to assess the number of activities in work, not jobs, activities that can be automated. The 5% speaks to, when you put it all together, I mean, most people's jobs consist of 20, 30 different activities. So if you then say, what proportion of occupations today have close to 100% of their activities that could be automated, that number is roughly 5%. In fact, the OECD has just done a recent study that has a number that's like 9%. So we're talking single digits by and large. The 60% in some ways is more interesting. The 60% speaks to the share of occupations where a part of them, about 30%, can be automated. That says people are going to be working with machines. The reason that's important, it starts to get us to questions around skilling to enable workers to work with those machines. It gets us to important economic concepts like skill-biased technical change. We know that when people work with machines alongside them, typically it's the higher skilled workers who benefit from that. So what happens to lower skilled workers is something we need to think through. Let me get to the second part, beyond automation. This is to do with wages. When you get to wages, we know that the share of wages has been under a lot of pressure. But in particular, we know that the gains from productivity have not always, in recent times, translated to wage growth. And that's actually important.
That might be a bit of an understatement, though.
It is an understatement, but I think we've always told ourselves the story that when we have productivity growth, we'll have wage growth. That story is largely true for a very long time. That relationship is not as robust as it used to be. And technology is part of that, although there are other factors. So I think we need to get to that. Then my final point is about the choices that we make. I think the choices that we make that could change the wages part of this in a better direction is if we can think about skilling. What choices do we make about how we encourage skilling and learning? This is a government question, it's a private sector question, it's an individual question. How do we think about helping transition workers who are dislocated through these means? We know that most economies spend some time and money on this. I think the average for the OECD is something like 0.6% of GDP across the OECD spent on active labor policies to help workers transition. It's particularly low in some countries like the United States. It's very high in the Nordics, for example. So what choices do we make about that? And then I'll put the final point on the table, which is what choices do we make about incomes? Today we're having lots of discussions, debate about universal basic income, some discussions about do we do that from the point of view of minimum wages, do we do that in terms of transfers, but what do we do about incomes? I think it's hard not to avoid that question.
We'll have this. Wait a minute, stay with me here. Can you put up the opinion poll again? Can you put up the opinion poll again now? The one that we had in the beginning? You only have to convince 30%, 40% of the people in the room. So we have a majority for the path to inclusive growth. So wage income will, of course, be very, very important. Caroline, you've been working on these. Thank you so much, James.
Sure.
You've been working exactly on these points when it comes to economy. And actually, what you're saying also is what we see as a disruptive force is not so much technology. It's the bad mistakes that we've been made, policy and economy-wise. Elaborate, please.
Yes, well, first of all, I think that the question has, you can answer it both ways. Absolutely, the digital economy can be, and I would argue, as James described, already is a path towards inclusive growth. But of course, yes, there are elements of it that are disruptive. That's not new. We've seen that with other changes that have come in economic possibilities and productivity changes and all sorts of automation. The first assembly line. We were discussing yesterday how people moved off the land and off agriculture in order to come into factories. So that was a big change. What I believe is that a lot of the unhappiness, discontent, feeling of separation that we're seeing, and there's a very big political problem for us now, and economic problem, is a response or is a reaction not so much to technology or automation, which after all does enable us to have higher incomes for the same amount of input, but is rather a response to a long period, a decade now since the financial crisis, when real incomes have just not grown very much. And I believe that as governments have responded to the crisis, first of all, we avoided a Great Depression again. That was terrific. That was all about macroeconomic, monetary and budgetary policy, especially monetary policy. And secondly, we are now seeing pretty reasonable growth across much of the Western world, but it has been really slow. And that is what is making people feel disconnected and upset. On top of that, there have been changes in employment patterns, changes, as we were discussing, in income, and people want to understand why has that happened and what's the fearful possible change. But I think it's important to remember that we've had 10 years, a decade, of very disappointing economic growth, which followed a financial crisis and was nothing to do with automation. Now, on the positive side, I just want, because we've had a lot of kind of depressing thoughts despite this outcome, and even the 40%, if it's a concern, is a large number. I want people just to step back and remember some of the magic. And James pointed to some of this with his 2 yeses. Right now, there are 3 billion people in the world that are online. That means they have access to information that was unthinkable. That is Google, the company that I now work for, has a sort of, its mission statement is about providing the internet and access to information, useful information, for everyone. We're not there yet. Mm-hmm. We have this project called NBU, or Next Billion Users, which is about bringing the next billion users online. But when you're online, in a single minute now, I'll just give you a couple more numbers, there are more than 4 million Google searches in 1 minute. There are $400 million of Alibaba sales, so it's not just Google. There is a whole lot of
Alibaba
commerce.
being the Chinese
Yes, being the Chinese e-commerce company. There are 400 hours of video uploaded every single minute. Now, you might think, well, that's kind of useless because it's all cat videos, or maybe even some of it is, my kids love,
what's
but never
so bad
mind.
about cat videos every once in a while?
What's wrong with cat videos? Yes.
Yeah.
It increases our happiness. And of course, much more seriously, there are concerns about extremist or ugly content online. But, and we and others commit to review that and take it down very quickly. But I want also to tell people, remind people, that YouTube, most of the use of YouTube, or much of it, is about people learning how to do things. They may be learning how to start a business online. They may be learning how to tie a tie. Also, there are 3 million people in the United States who are subscribers to the Khan Academy, which teaches calculus and a whole lot of other skills, which was begun by a professor who wanted to teach his niece calculus, a teacher, and he put that online, and it's become huge.
Open universities, yeah.
Yes. Well, there are the big universities that use MOOCs, but this Khan Academy, which my colleagues and I were discussing this morning, is a way for people to learn things. So there are huge possibilities of making people's lives better through the internet. I completely agree with James that governments and the private sector have to work together to make sure that everybody does get included in this digital economy. And
we'll have to find out how exactly they're going to do this.
Yes.
And this is where we want to go back to your maybe, because the maybe is in a field that's not unimportant. It's
That's
about
right.
wages. It's about, it couldn't be more existential to people's lives. And then there's an element in it that I thought was also, we could talk about basic income. We could talk about minimum wage, but hey, think about, for a moment, in almost any language, Many of our last names are modeled after what our ancestors were doing once. So if it's not us doing it anymore, but artificial intelligence, even if we are safe and sound and, we can pay for our apartments and, our lives, how do we get a sense of life if we, don't have something that really defines
work
us?
is really important, but just think even 5, 10, 15 years ago, would any of us have been able to imagine nobody would have imagined my current job. Nobody probably, maybe Ambroise, your job was still there. But there are many others.
There's some people out there who are afraid that people in 20 years from now cannot imagine my job anymore.
Yes,
because
of course.
algorithms can write sometimes better pieces, no offense to somebody, than some of the really awful academic texts that I have to edit. So perhaps my job will go away because, AI can do it much better and never gets tired and doesn't need as much coffee as I need.
Okay, I'm going to give you one other fact. ATMs, that's one of the biggest innovations, as Paul Volcker once said. Forget all the derivatives and everything. Banks actually came up with cash machines, which many, many people use. You would think that the establishment of automatic tellers would stop the need for people tellers. But that's wrong. Actually, in the United States, there are more bank service employees because there are other things for them to do. So I think that we may not be able to imagine. This is one place where the economists, who are normally called, the dismal science of economics, the economists, I think, actually are more optimistic about the future of work than some technologists, because economists have maybe looked more at all of the changes that have occurred in the past and the way that the way that societies can adapt, and people start doing things that no one would have dreamed of. Instead of riding a horse and cart, people are flying aeroplanes.
Well,
who would have thought of that?
Obviously, they have to adapt. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Obviously, they have to adapt a lot faster than they did. And then there's another phenomenon, Ambroise, that I would like to throw at you. What we see is a kind of jump over the technological gap in the developing countries. We've seen it in the realm of telecommunication. Landlines were never a big thing. They just jumped basically to mobile phones, used the opportunities that were there with mobile devices. What we can say is specifically for Germany is that very often small and medium enterprises are not very fast to adapt to what Industry 4.0 offers them in opportunities. So we have a gap not only within societies that's growing much more in sophisticated industrialized economies, and we have a gap between developing economies and developed economies when it comes to embracing new technologies. What is it that you would like to do about closing these two gaps?
At EIB, we, as the Bank of the European Union, we are more working on trying to get solutions within the European Union.
Of course, naturally, yeah.
Related to developing countries. But let me start with a small anecdote. Last year, I met with the mayor of a small village in Alsace, which is a beautiful part of eastern France, next to Germany. And what he said was he had just won something that is well known in France. We have a competition to have the most beautiful village. And he won that. And what he told me is, after this award, the president of the region came to him and said, well, I know you are going to ask me for something. You are going to ask me for more parking spaces so that tourists can come in numbers. And he told me, I told him, I don't want that. Give me broadband. And what he was needed was to have access to digital for the population of a rural part of Alsace. What we see more and more, and this is a project that we have financed as a public bank to develop access to broadband and to this kind of internet access in rural or low-density areas where the private sector does not necessarily come or not enough to get this increase and improvement in access to technology. We have done just a study with YTILI with the Bruegel Institute, which is a think tank here in Brussels, and with the World Economic Forum. That shows clearly that while it was clear in the past that you could say, well, let's have growth come first and inclusiveness will come next, we have today to see that together. And we will not have growth if we do not have at the same time growth and inclusiveness.
But how do you go about the inclusiveness? What is it that you exactly do? How do you invest? What is the measures that you're taking to provide for this inclusiveness?
So what we try to do is we are a bank that makes projects. We try to develop projects that, for example, give access to those who don't have access, that give money, or these are loans, to SMEs, access to finance for SMEs. And when you talk to these kind of people, what they say is, quite often, and I've witnessed that many times, you are financing 3 years of research and development for us. This is something that is great for one reason. We should concentrate on our future, which is create the right products and finding the right markets. And what we have to do is to get financing. And that is very time-consuming, and it is very...
Yeah, and from what I understand from Caroline, what you also have to do is you have to sort of convince these people that in the digital world there is a market for them, because it seems to me that they haven't discovered the opportunities yet that they have to find for different markets. It's not the next door neighbor anymore, and it's not the old business acquaintances or business relations they have. They have to really kind of conquer new markets for themselves, don't they?
Yeah, they do, absolutely. And
how do you help with that?
Well, we have with financing and with giving examples of what we do.
Education as well?
Education as well. And here I have something to say. We've made a survey of 12,000 entrepreneurs in Europe, in whole Europe, and asked them which are the big impediments for you to invest. By the way, they were quite positive in terms of the level of investment and future investment that they were expecting to do, which is good news for Europe. What they said was, to my surprise, not business regulations are too cumbersome, or market or labor market is not functioning properly. What they say was something that did not surprise me that much, which is uncertainty about the future is the biggest impediment for investment. But the second one was, we don't have the available workers with appropriate skills.
So that's one of, yeah, we can take this away. This is one of the major things that we have to do. And I think you would, I mean, so far you would all agree, you have to do a much more rapid education qualification program to do what, you know, when Chancellor Merkel was in Washington, she took with her an apprentice who said, well, he's the guy who fixes the robot when the robot is sick and can't fix the cars anymore. So it's not the mechanic who's doing the fixing of the cars, it's the mechanic who's fixing the robot who's doing the mechanics on the car. So he needs different qualifications. And obviously, it's not enough what we do right now. So there has to be more on it, right?
There has to be more, and that's why actually the Europeans are implementing what we call the Juncker Plan, which is a plan to speed up the process of investment.
I'm not sure whether this is a very sexy name. I mean, just
the official name is not sexy either. This is an investment plan for Europe.
I never deal with the official EU names because it's a lot of big capital letters, and I never get it straight. I call it the Juncker Plan. Then.
The idea is we have a deficit in Europe. We have two problems in terms of what we are talking about now. The first one is we have a deficit in innovation. We are not at the level of innovation that is commensurate with the targets we have set for 2020.
Yeah.
And we have a deficit in investment. And during the crisis, we have dropped significantly, and the rebound is less pronounced than the one that we see in the US, in Asia, etc.
Yeah.
So the idea beyond this initiative was to boost investment, especially investment that has a high level of risk.
Thank you. That's a very important point also to take away, because we know Europe is by far not as competitive as it could be and it should be when it comes to the digital area. Robert, I would like to ask you something, because you're all for innovation. We were just talking a bit before we came in here, and you're the most, I mean, you're all enthusiasts. You're all techie enthusiasts, which is great. But you're the greatest enthusiast in this round, my feeling. But I really would like to ask you, Donald Trump really won the elections also because he made a very 19th century promise. He basically pretended that the jobs were going away because of Mexico and China and all these unfair traders. But that's not the case. And they're not coming back the way 19th century style. They're not going to be manufacturing jobs. It's going to be jobs in the digital world, right? So how often do you venture out to these people who still dream about the steel mills coming back, and you would have to convince them, guys, it's not the steel mills, get some digital education, because this is how you get back into the workforce. What do you do with them? Because we're all in a bubble. We all like technology, apart from the 40% that will be convinced easily by you. But how do you convince these people?
Well, thank you. Look, I think part of the problem here is, as you alluded to earlier, you said that we've got the diagnosis right, we've got to figure out the solution. I actually don't think we have the diagnosis right. We've done work when you look at actually the loss of US manufacturing jobs, when you measure it properly, half of the jobs we lost in the 2000s, over a third of our manufacturing jobs, highest rate of loss since the Great Depression, half of that was due to trade. Half of it was due to unfair trade practices that other countries engaged in. So I think we've got to think about that. The other part of the diagnosis that we all sort of bought into is the economy is growing at a robust rate, but there are a few people being left out. And that's simply not true. Carolyn made, I think, a very good point. You've seen lowest rates of US productivity growth in American history in the last 10 years. Never have we seen this low a rate of productivity growth. And Europe is half of the American rate of growth. Why aren't we talking about productivity? How can you raise wages for people at the bottom or the middle when you don't even raise productivity? So James said he's a yes, yes, maybe. I'm a yes, yes, almost certain framework. And let me tell you why. So the frame of this all discussion is somehow we're all zooming ahead because we've got our iPad, and there's a whole bunch of people who are not zooming ahead. In fact, maybe they're even actively being hurt by that. And let me, first of all, reject that. One of the claims that is in that argument is that there's a few people, probably Carolyn's bosses, who are making bazillions of dollars in the software industry, and that this is sort of this unequal industry. Well, let me give you a really interesting study that Jonathan Rothwell at Brookings did about just last summer. And Jonathan looked at who are the top 1%ers in the American economy. What occupations and industries do the 1%ers work in? There are 5 times more dentists in the 1% than there are people who work in Carolyn's industry. So if you really want to look at
dentists work a lot with 3D printing right now.
That's not why they're in the 1%. They're in the 1% because they have a protected guild. So let's think about that. That's not what's going on with inequality. What's going on with inequality is a set of professions, largely, and financiers who are able to extract rents. It had nothing to do with digital. The other thing I think we have to recognize is I think we have a false expectation that somehow these new technologies automatically get adopted immediately by everybody in the world, and therefore, if they don't, there's something wrong. Well, let me take you back to 1940 in the United States, and in Massachusetts, 5% of the households did not have a flush toilet. This was a sort of relatively new innovation in America, kind of came about in the 1910s. 81% of Mississippi residents did not have a flush toilet in 1940. Did we say that flush toilets were holding people back and keeping people out? No, what we said was, as technologies emerge, as people get more money, they're able to buy in. So I think we have to recognize the same dynamic is there. The other thing, I think James really hit the nail on the head. Even if you're not a user, even if you, for some reason, has chosen not to be engaged in this enterprise, you get enormous benefits today from all of us using it. To give you an example, when I use a Nest thermostat at home, I'm saving energy, and I'm reducing the cost of energy for people who don't use a Nest thermostat, and I'm reducing global air emissions for people who don't use a Nest thermostat. When I do e-government, I'm reducing the cost of government. So people who aren't using e-government get lower cost services. One I like a lot, when I use Amazon, which I think is every day, I get a package at my door, I am saving 14 times the amount of energy than if I were to drive to the store and pick up the package and bring it to my home. So the non-user, the person...
Don't tell that to your local librarian, please.
Pardon me?
Don't tell that to your local librarian, please.
Well, the local librarian is going to lose their job. There's no question, which I'll come back to. I'm just saying, we'll hear. So, and lastly...
Well, I see the numbers. I see the numbers dropping right now. You know, I mean, you have to put in something really positive now to make up for the librarian losing its job.
One positive thing, then back to you. We at Google are making it easier for libraries in the United States to be online, to have high-speed internet, to be small areas where people who don't have the broadband access can go to get it. So there are actually, I don't think the librarian will lose his or her job. I think their job will evolve, and that's great.
So there are fewer librarians today. What is going to happen, I think, particularly for low-income people, is you're going to have, which we already have in most libraries, at least in the US, digitized collections, and you can rent out or loan out your book on your Kindle or your... I think libraries will evolve and become digital hubs. There will be fewer people going to the library. One last other example on this, by the way, I don't know how many people use Yelp here, but it's a rating system in the US. There's very clear evidence when people use Yelp to rate a restaurant that the restaurant quality goes up, the inspections for disease and all these other problems go down. So again, users are benefiting non-users. You look at it from the business side, there's a very good OECD study from about 2 months ago, looked at 117 countries around the world, and it said, how do companies that use the internet, what is the spillover of that effect? And what they found was that companies that use the internet benefit companies in those 117 developed countries that don't use the internet. So the last point I'll just make on this is, you can look at all these applications, which I think people really don't recognize. There are thousands of applications today. Text-to-speech software for blind people. We are tracking disease outbreaks. Google's doing this and others, so we can know diseases in real time. Customized lesson plans. Microsoft has developed software that they've piloted in the Tacoma School District that predicts high school dropout rates. After the school system adopted this software, dropouts went down, graduation rates went up from 55 to 78%. So you see this mapping poverty, mapping vision loss for people with diabetes, refugee mental health. So I think to say somehow that this technology is not massively improving people's lives is to miss the point. And the last thing I'll just say, we have this sort of mythology in here, which I've heard constantly this morning, that we're in the most disruptive time we've ever been in. It's actually the exact opposite. So we've done new research, which will be out in about 3 weeks, where we've looked at every decade in the US from 1850 to the present, and what decade had the most occupational churn? In other words, the most people losing their jobs and new occupations was 1850. 1860 was number 2. And what we forget about that, and what was the lowest? 2000 to 2015. Absolutely lowest rate of occupational churn. We forget that there used to be an awful lot of occupational churn. People lose their jobs. And I worry that we're in a world now where we don't accept any occupational loss. The point to the librarian. We're in a world where we can't say that we can't have any technological change. I don't think we want to be in that world. I wouldn't want to have told farmers 100 years ago, by the way, your kids are going to have to work on a farm and not make very much money. And what we did is we got rid of 70, 80, 90% of the farmers who then moved up and did other things.
Thanks. Are we at the core of the problem here? James, come in. Yeah, do you want to say something?
I was going to jump in. I think one thing that's coming clearly from everybody, and I think I agree with my colleagues, is that the benefits to the economy, to users, and to society, I think are overwhelmingly positive. The reason I want to come back to the maybes is because I think we shouldn't be complacent about that, because otherwise if we ignore the maybe portion of what I suggested, we'll go along blithely and suddenly we don't do enough to adjust. So let me point out 2 things in the maybe that I think are important. One is, one of the big debates that many of us are having right now is this time different when it comes to questions of automation? Is this different? Should we look to the past for examples, or is this time different? I think there's a sense in which it isn't, actually, because we've seen this with agriculture, with manufacturing, with new jobs being created in other sectors, so we've done that well. But I think there are 2 reasons why it's worth considering why it may be different this time. One of those is if you look at the previous waves of automation, almost all of them were about mechanical automation. We were simply making things that humans could do faster, better, stronger, at larger scale. It was mechanical, more, faster, heavy, and so forth. I think what may be different this time is that we're now tackling mostly cognitive things with machine learning, artificial intelligence.
This is what makes it so difficult, because it has to do with the mental mindset.
It gets to do the mental mindset. It starts to touch many more things across the board. And it also, when you start to make kind of the advances that machine learning and AI are making, you're starting to go beyond simply making labor capital trade-offs, because you're now getting benefits that potentially go beyond human capabilities. I think that may be different. The other thing that may be also different this time is the fact that the rates of change are different than in previous periods.
It's the 19th century on speed.
Yeah, we had time to adapt. We had time to get on educational institutions.
And people back then felt that they didn't have time to adapt.
Absolutely. And I think we know that now people are going through 4 or 5 different changes in their career. So I think it's worth considering what's different this time. And then I'd also maybe take a little bit of issue with my good friend and colleague Caroline to say, I think the wage question, I don't think is just about the crash. I think it's easy for us to say, oh, if only the financial crisis hadn't happened, wages would have been fine. I think if you look at the wage trends, they started to change before that, even before the crash. One thing that's quite striking to me, and this is actually work that various people have done, is that if you looked at the share of the national income that goes to the bottom 90%, which is basically everybody, that was largely stable up until about the 1980s. It was basically, in the US economy, it's basically 2/3 of national income. Since 1980, it's been coming down. Now it's about half. And that's changing. So there's this increasing divergence between wage share that goes to wage income versus. So I think it's a mistake to simply think that as soon as our economies grow again, wages will be fine. I don't think that's quite right.
Let's take this with us also. I would like to get all of you in here. First of all, let's do word cloud. Can we get the word cloud up? What is it that comes to your mind when you think of an inclusive innovation? Just to get a feel of what you expect and what it is and what it should be. So you vote now, and in the meantime, I just go to these young people here, and I would like to ask them, can we have a mic over here somewhere? And I would like to ask them, those are the people in different capacities responsible to make innovation more inclusive. What is it that you want from these guys?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ayat from France, and I'm currently in the campaign of the socialist candidate for the presidential election. So actually, I'm for the basic universal income. And why is that? Because I think that, sure, we have, for more inclusive society, we have to give the skills to people to adapt to the new technologies, because I'm convinced that new technologies are the future, and they drive the society, up. And I think that the basic universal income is like a temporary solution to get the time to make people adapt. And I just wanted to have your points, your point of views on this conception.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Would you agree? Would you agree that education, because look at word cloud, education is very high up there.
Yes.
Education, opportunities, skills. So it's going into this direction, education. Caroline?
Yes, we heard the example of Khan Academy, which is, I think, perfect example to create an inclusive platform accessible for everyone.
Yeah. So should it be public-private
and of
partnerships as well?
I was going to say, on the Khan economy, as James pointed out, that comes from YouTube, which is free, which is a free service. And therefore, but you do need the access, you need the broadband, you need people to have smartphones. Although, as I mentioned earlier, now I was told that there is a smartphone for every individual on Earth. Now, of course, those are not equally distributed either. I want to say two things about the word cloud. Education. We need digital skills. we need to partner the public and the private sector. And we've been doing that. We at Google have committed to educate 2 million people across Europe on digital skills. 1 million's already done, and the other 1 million is going. And the way that's happening is, for example, in Italy, we had a program. We realized that a lot of people in China, for example, want high-quality Italian products, but they don't know how to get them. And so we worked with the government, local and national in Italy, to train young unemployed people on skills and how to market things digitally and put them together with companies. And this is an amazing thing that's now possible. Digital skills and teaching small businesses how to get online. A French example, about 70% of French shoppers use online shopping. But only about 15% of French producers and stores put their goods online. So you also need to educate
looking for new markets.
So that they can get to the new markets. On opportunity and access, just to say that Google has this platform called Android, which is, the idea was to make smartphone technology available for any manufacturer, any service. And the cost of smartphones, which, the big, expensive, nice iPhones, which probably many of you have, is closer to
I have a very old one.
Okay. Probably around $600 per phone. We now have phones that on average, the Android ones are about $200, but more excitingly, there are phones available in Nigeria, in India, for less than $50 per phone. So that's another way that we need to work to get things made available to many people.
Thank you so much.
Can I just quickly say...
come in, yeah.
My name is Rusa Khan. I'm from Amsterdam. I'm not related to Mr. Khan, but I'm really proud of him. I just wanted to make a point about accessibility. In Amsterdam, the municipality of Amsterdam gives free laptop or computer and internet stipend to parents who have with low income. So I think that's a great way to make internet digital accessibility possible for people with low income.
Thanks. James, very quickly, because then I'm going here for questions and I'm going over there for questions.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the question on income that was asked, which is on the universal basic income. I think we need to solve for incomes. I'm not a big fan of universal basic income, and the reason is because I think work is so many things bundled together. It's a way to get income, it's a way to get dignity, a sense of self-respect, creativity, community, and a whole bunch of things. And universal basic income simply goes at the income portion of that and doesn't get at the other things. I'd much rather think about how do we help and engage on minimum wage, for example, because it's linked to work. How do we do conditioned transfers that are linked to people engaging, participating, getting involved in things, whether they are their own education or community activities. So I'm more for those kinds of solutions to income as opposed to universal basic, as currently and mostly proposed.
Thanks, James. Perhaps we collect a few questions. You go first.
Yes, Gail Maddox from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My question has to do with the women in the field. Caroline, maybe you could address part of this, because I know that Google's has had outreach programs and all. But how do we solve that? I mean, the numbers actually have not steadily gone up. I mean, there is not the number of workers and all, and there's some really very serious problems within the field. How do we bring more women into that, and how do we solve some of the problems with the women now in the field?
Thanks.
Yeah,
so can we just have two or three and throw them in? Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Owen Larter. I work for Microsoft in the UK. It's picking up a little bit on the UBI point, but it's a question about our social institutions more broadly. And I think it's interesting to look back at previous technological revolutions and reassuring to see that by and large they've led to a better society, but they've also led to very different societies. I'm thinking particularly about the ways that societies responded in the early part of the 20th century with the welfare state, 40-hour working week, labour laws. Do we feel that our current social institutions are equipped to deal with the disruption that is about to unfold? And if not, how do we need to change them?
Who do you want to answer this question?
All
Don't
of them.
say all of them.
Okay, well, James in particular, because he was very engaged and nodding, so I like that. And then also perhaps over here as well.
Okay, thanks. Okay, let's put these two. I'll have you on my radar. Caroline, women, there's another gap here. Too few women in the techie field.
Definitely too few women in the techie field. Now, before I joined the techie field, I was in economics and finance, and I can tell you there are too few women there as well. And I think
we have more women on the audience side of the question. Is okay.
One nice piece of data is that of the people that we're training in digital skills in Europe, 47% are women. And many, because you don't need to be an engineer. We're talking about skills that enable people to work in this society and with these issues, and to get their businesses online, to work for businesses that are online, to meet, as Ambroise said, this lack of skilled workers that businesses note. So I think that the education and access are really important elements of bringing more women into this space. In terms of, and clearly at Google we've been very clear about, sexual harassment and so on is not allowed, and I think that that's also an issue for society. Again, thinking of my previous career. And then the point about universal basic income, I agree with James, and I also want to say that, of course, we need to take these issues and concerns seriously. I think you put, really got the nail on the head, because there is a question about our societies and how we respond. I think there is a growing interest in improving things that in the US are called trade adjustment assistance, which is an old program and it's too small now. But we need to think about how to boost the role of workers, how to adapt with support for people as they make these transitions. And I think those are questions for governments and for societies and for economists as opposed to technologists, probably.
One suggestion for you in the audience who want to ask questions, I have a few more here, but if you throw them at me via the app, that would be really helpful, because then I can bundle them, because some of them go into the same direction. It would be helpful, James, to pick up this question. And then I also have someone here, how to deal with the time lag between technological innovation and policy response. And then there is a question even about taxing robots. And it goes basically into the direction of, technology and innovation by definition is fast. Policy response sometimes, especially in open democratic consensus-based systems, is much slower. How do we get these two together? That's basically, how do we respond to this? And I find the robot question actually really interesting,
Well, actually, I think the robot question is referring to, I think Bill Gates was quoted recently saying maybe we should just tax the robots. But I think even though that's a flippant comment, I think there's something within that, because if in fact the inputs that are going towards generating output in our economy, which have largely been labor and capital to a large extent, we tax one and not the other at some level. So I think there's something to think through in that question. Related to the same question, which goes to how quickly our institutions are adapting, I think there are at least two areas where at least I'd like to see more adaptation. One is around, one of the things, if you look at the incentive system in most economies, I know it's certainly the case in the US, and I think in most advanced economies, we've created a whole set of incentives to encourage businesses to make capital investments. We give them R&D tax credits. We do all these things to incent that kind of behavior. We don't quite have the same set of things that are oriented towards incenting human capital investments by businesses. I think that's something that we ought maybe to think about. How do we do more on that front than we've done historically, similar to what we do with capital and R&D investments, for example. So I'd love to see some response there. The other area I'd love to see response is back to this point about helping people transition. I think it's quite striking, and I started to mention the numbers earlier. I think it is quite striking that across the OECD, as I said, the average in terms of labor market assistance programs, that's a broad definition, that as a percentage of GDP, it's about 0.6%. Some countries like the Nordics are very high. It's about 1.5 to 2.1%. For some countries, the US being one of them, it's actually quite low. And in fact, it's actually gone down in the last few years. So I think there's something about how do we assist and help people transition. I think this applies to the digital economy pretty much, probably as much as it does to globalization, where we have not done as good a response in helping people transition and adapt to the dislocations.
Because this goes so much into the response and how we deal with it field. Ambroise and Robert, will you give a quick answer? And then I really would like to get another round here.
Yeah, so look, I think the idea that we would even take seriously Bill Gates' idea, that it would even emerge in the press is really an astounding indictment of how far down we've gone. Okay, we have the single biggest problem in the developing world. The single biggest economic challenge is basically flat productivity growth. You cannot raise wages without productivity growth. You cannot raise productivity without new technology. In the United States, we've had flat CapEx investment by the private sector for 15 years. That rate has not gone up. They are not investing in machinery and equipment. They're hoarding capital. They're giving it back to the shareholders. The worst thing we could do, by far, would be to tax capital. And not capital when it comes out, but to tax machines, because that means companies will not invest. It means we're not going to raise productivity. And the last point on this, again, it's striking to me we have this conversation. We've looked at data from the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics. The odds of losing your job in the United States from a downsizing or a closure are the lowest in 20 years. The lowest. It's just continued to go down. The odds of losing your job in the last 10 years from technological disruption, the lowest it's ever been. So
why is the impression then so big that it's not the case? Why is it that so much is blamed on technology?
The wages.
Well, it's partly wages, but it's also this thing. We all look at this and we go, oh, there must be disruption, and now I'm doing Uber. There actually was an increase in the last 5 years in the US in the number of travel agents. Nobody would have guessed that. Nobody would have guessed that.
Don't tell me it's going up.
No, the travel agents are going up. Yeah, there are more travel agents now than there were.
Why don't I use more travel agents then? Why am I making all these mistakes, booking the wrong flight? Did this ever happen to you?
That's why you're more
booking
travel
the wrong
agents.
flights? Ambroise.
Very quickly, for me, to try to close the gap between the policy and the reality of all the perception. Perception is also important. Is investment. We need to invest more, and to invest more in infrastructure.
But that goes for the public sector, but obviously also goes for the private sector. You can't, innovation cannot go straight to the shareholders. It has to be reinvested into kind of adaptation to innovation, right? Sorry for interrupting.
Let me just give you two examples. The first one is there is a mining part of Belgium, there is a mining part of France that is suffering a lot from the closing of the mines.
Of course.
And
that we've seen in
when
Great
you look
Britain
at the
also.
situation in this part, and we've done that in northern France, you see that 40% of the population doesn't have any car. And you have jobs in some pockets of the region, but they don't have access to that. So it's infrastructure.
Access is a big word on the word cloud as well.
Access is a big word. And it's not only access to digital, it's just access, physical access also to get a job. What we are investing now is to create a transport system that will be quick, a bus, a special bus line, for those people to be able to try to get a renewed access to the labor market. Because if we don't do that, then the risk is that, yes, everybody has the feeling that it benefits from innovation, but the perception is that this is concentrated on the big cities and the richest part of the country, and you end up with something
at the
which
periphery,
is exactly
in every sense. Thanks. This has to be a really quick question because my bosses tell me I have about 4 minutes left.
Okay,
now.
so I'm going to ask a question about culture. So I work with cultural heritage, and digital technology has done a lot for culture. Especially Google Arts and Culture Project is amazing. But what we want to do in heritage is to preserve a traditional way of making things. For one of the reasons is cultural tourism. People pay a lot of money to go somewhere and to see how is something being traditionally done. And like whole countries live from tourism. So what digital technology and development can do actually to help this and to work all together in a meaningful idea in the future?
Does any one of you want to take up this question? What would come to my mind would be Pompeii, where actually they found a way of course, everybody wants to see it because you want to have a feel. I don't think the old analog things go away because of digital innovation, but they combine it with great digital, kind of shows to make it more haptic and kind. Do you want to answer?
Well, as you say, Google has developed what was called the Cultural Institute to develop arts and culture, and also allow people from all over the low-income children in the United States can have these what are called cardboards, very simple technology. Well, it's very complicated technology, but simple to use. It's like putting on a pair of glasses where you can then see the technology and the arts. The technology allows you to see these beautiful cultural artifacts. I think the other way that maybe we can work together is, again, on YouTube, you can see how to make some original crafts. And my daughter's boyfriend has learned how to make bread in a very basic way. That's not a beautiful cultural artifact, but it is an old skill from looking at YouTube. So from learning recipes. So there are ways that you can preserve some of those things. But I wholeheartedly agree with Robert that what we need is to encourage more of this, but make sure that the benefits are spread.
One more. Wrap up. No, my bosses tell me to wrap up. Okay. I know who my boss is here. The nice gentleman in the back there. My apologies for everyone who would like to ask questions, and my suggestion for GMF is you should do even more techie sessions because they're great, because they're really interesting, because I think that they really get to the core of what we are talking about. Technology is politics these days, like foreign policy is domestic politics these days. So my apologies for all of you who couldn't ask questions. Use the app more. It's actually much easier if I get them on here, because then I can throw them at these guys immediately. What I would like to do is play me the opinion poll from the beginning again, and let's see whether our panel has managed to convince the 40% that was thinking that innovation is more for disrupting force. Can we have this vote again now? And let's see what happens. It's like a TED. It's like all these reality shows where people SMS in and say, I want this candidate in and this candidate out. So
I think the Robert made.
Here we are. So okay. What is the result? Yay. You've done a pretty good job. Thank you so much. And thank you, audience, for being here. Thanks a lot. Oh, do I say that now it's lunchtime? Sure. It's lunchtime. It's lunchtime. Enjoy your lunch and keep up with the conversation.
Ladies and gentlemen, lunch will take place both at the Lobby Lounge and at Wiltshires Cafe. You're free to go.